Relax and listen to the voice. 10 holes. In a little village not that far from here, there was a problem. Animals had started dying off one by one. In the morning, their owners would see them lying outside with 10 holes in their chest. The people thought it was the work of their neighboring townsfolk. Then, one night, a man by the name of Fred was closing his store for the night. It was very late, and he was anxious to get home to his family. He shut off all the lights, then closed the door with a satisfying click. As he turned around to go to his car, he saw a dark shape in the distance. He stood still, trying to make out what it was. As it got closer, Fred turned to go. It was the last move he ever made. The next day, they found him with 10 holes in his chest. This occurrence made the town quite worried. They were scared of more people getting killed. So one night, two brave brothers, John and Jacob, went out to get rid of the problem. They each took knives and walkie-talkies. They said goodbye to their father and kissed their grandmother on the way out. The two boys decided to split up. One would go by the side of the murder, and the other would wander the streets. If one was attacked, they could use their walkie-talkie to contact each other. So they set off, keeping a close eye on the shadows. Nothing seemed to be happening. It was a calm night, and they seemed like they would get home safely. But then, suddenly, John heard a crackling in the bushes behind him. He tried to call his brother, but it was already too late. The figure leapt out of the bushes and tackled him, gouging his chest with its nails. Luckily, Jacob heard the commotion and rushed to help him. He leapt through the air and cut off the creature's right hand. The creature screamed in pain and ran away. Jacob didn't know what to do at this point, so he gathered his brother John up and took him into the hospital, carrying him the whole way. Once at the hospital, the boys were met with a flurry of questions, which they did not seem to have a good, solid, sensible answer to. Many attempts were made to call the boys' parents, but the parents were never available. After a considerable amount of time at the hospital, the boys were free to go. The doctors had listened to their story, and they had decided to bandage John up and send him home. Since they didn't know what to make of the boys' story, they just called the boys heroes and thanked them for what they had done for the town. The boys left the hospital and finally got home at around 6 a.m. that morning. When the boys finally walked through their door, they noticed that their grandmother was the only one home and awake, as she was sitting in her chair in the living room. They thought that they might tell their grandmother all about the evening that they had had, how they had fought off the monster and saved the town. They quickly took into account that it was very early in the morning, and they didn't want to startle their grandmother or excite her too much and disturb her old heart. Instead, the boys decided to kiss their grandmother on the head, tell her good morning, and walk up to their bedroom. Their grandmother smiled the smile that she always had. She seemed happy to see them. As they walked up to their bedroom, neither of the boys had realized that during their interaction with their grandmother, she sat in a chair bleeding, as she was missing a hand. A house of terror. The car finally gave out. Jeff hit the dashboard in frustration. It was bad enough that the car had to break down, but at night, in the rain, and in the middle of God knows wherever he was, it was a fitting end to his bad week. The week had seen his wife leave him, taking the kids with her. He had been demoted at his job and was now forced to go back on the road as a salesman. Now this had happened, and things weren't going to get any better anytime soon, so it seemed. Jeff decided that he might as well try to find a way out of this mess. He considered waiting in his car for another car to come by and help him. The road wasn't often used though, and that might take hours, so Jeff decided to first walk down the road and see if there were any other choices. After walking for a half an hour or so in the pouring rain, Jeff finally came across an old house in the woods. Now, Jeff had seen enough horror movies to make him turn back, but the rain alone was enough to override his sense of fear and trepidation. He walked up the winding road to the door. The house looked to be very old and not kept up well, and Jeff wondered if anyone even lived there anymore. He knocked on the door, and to his surprise, it was answered rather quickly. An older man, looking to be in his late 70s, asked him what he wanted. Jeff went on to explain the situation and asked if the man had a phone or some way to help him. The old man said that he was very wary of travelers, but decided that Jeff looked honest enough and let him use his phone. Jeff thanked him profusely and asked his name. The old man said his name was Joseph Palmer, and he told Jeff the number of the nearest garage. Jeff made his way through to the phone, noticing that the house looked about as old inside as it did outside, and he was surprised that there was even a phone at the place. He called the garage, but they said there was nothing they could do until the morning, and that they would meet him at noon at his car. Mr. Palmer offered Jeff the guest room to sleep in for the night. Jeff was a bit wary at spending the night in such a spooky old house, but decided that the walk back in the rain and sleeping in his car couldn't be much safer than staying at the house. He accepted, and he was shown to the guest room. The old house was adorned with antique everything. Not a single piece of furniture seemed to have been purchased in at least the last 60 years. Mr. Palmer showed him the room and bid him a good night. The man seemed nice enough, but the whole situation still left Jeff unnerved. He just tried to tell himself that he had watched far too many horror movies as a child. The bedroom had a canopy bed, one old lamp, a single window, and a red carpet. The house was eerily quiet as Jeff laid himself down on the bed. Quiet, except for a creak here and a thump there. By now, Jeff's imagination had him too paranoid to sleep as he heard Mr. Palmer outside the room, walking up and down the hallway. Up he went, and down he went. Then, the footsteps stopped right outside of his room. Jeff waited, yet nothing happened. A half an hour passed, and yet he heard nothing except for the rain beating outside and the wind howling as the storm blew on. Finally, sleep slowly overcame Jeff, even with his nervousness heightened. Slowly, his eyes closed, though he thought he could almost hear something scratching at his door. Jeff awoke. The storm had passed, and daylight was shining through the window curtains. Happy that all of his nervousness was for nothing, Jeff got out of bed and checked his watch. He had slept in until 11:20 and had to leave quickly before the people from the garage got to his car. Leaving the room, he was greeted by Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer asked him if he had slept well. Jeff replied that he had, though he had trouble falling asleep. Mr. Palmer laughed and asked if he was afraid of the old house at night in the middle of nowhere. Jeff admitted that maybe he was a bit afraid, and he felt a little silly for it now. He thanked Mr. Palmer and said he had to leave quickly to get to his car. He turned to leave when suddenly something banged his head and everything went quite dark. When Jeff came to, he was tied to a chair in the basement. The place reeked of horrible smells. Mr. Palmer walked up to him with a large knife in his hand. Jeff screamed and tried to free himself, but only tired himself out. He looked up in horror at Mr. Palmer and asked him why he was doing this, and why now. Mr. Palmer answered that last night he would have been nervous, full of fear, and ready for any attack Palmer would have. No, last night wasn't the right time. Everyone expects attacks at night. But during the morning, people are more relaxed and the fear is low, making them blind to any chance of harm. Jeff asked him again, why was he doing this? What was he going to do with him? And said someone like the garage people would find out what had happened. Mr. Palmer said that mishaps happen on highways at night, mainly during storms, so hardly anyone would even think twice as to why he was gone. If anyone actually did start asking questions, Mr. Palmer said he had ways to discourage that kind of activity. As for why he was doing this, Mr. Palmer simply said that Jeff need not to worry about that. In fact, he need not to worry about anything anymore. Jeff looked into Palmer's eyes as he walked towards him. His eyes were completely black, and the last thing Jeff did was try to scream. Army of the Dead. A laundress, newly moved to Charleston following the Civil War, found herself awakened at the stroke of 12 each night by the rumble of heavy wheels passing in the street. But she lived on a dead-end street and had no explanation for the noise. Her husband would not allow her to look out the window when she heard the sounds, telling her to leave well enough alone. Finally, she asked the woman who washed at the tub next to hers. The woman said, "What you're hearing is an army of the dead. They are Confederate soldiers who died in hospital without knowing that the war was over. Each night they rise from their graves and go to reinforce Lee in Virginia to strengthen the weakened Southern forces." The next night, the laundress slipped out of bed to watch the army of the dead pass. She stood spellbound by the window as the gray fog rolled past. Within the fog, she could see the shapes of horses and could hear gruff human voices and the rumble of cannons being dragged through the street, followed by the sound of marching feet. Foot soldiers, horsemen, ambulances, wagons, and cannons passed before her eyes, all shrouded in gray. After what seemed like hours, she heard a far-off bugle blast, and then silence. When the laundress came out of her daze, she found one of her arms was paralyzed. She has never done a full days of washing ever since. The Backseat Maniac. There's a girl driving along I-70 on the way back to Colorado after visiting her relatives in Illinois. It's about 1 a.m. and it starts raining when she realizes she's almost out of gas. She sees a sign for a gas station about 3 miles ahead, breathes a sigh of relief. But when she gets there, she sees it's one of those old, run-down, family-owned gas stations. She's kind of scared to stop, but she really has no other choice. As she pulls in, an old man with a disfigured face comes running through the rain. He puts the pump in the tank and asks for her credit card. She hands it to him over the top of the window, and he runs back inside. After a few seconds, he comes back out and tells the girl she'll have to come inside, and that her card has been denied. Reluctantly, she walks inside. The old man grabs her and tries to tell her something, but she hits him with a can of oil sitting on the counter. She runs back out to her car and takes off with the old man screaming at her and chasing her, flailing his arms. After driving for a few miles, she turns on the radio and starts to relax. As she looks in the rearview mirror, she sees someone pop up in the back seat holding an axe above her head. It's the last thing she ever sees. Apparently, the old man at the gas station was trying to warn her. The Lick of a Dog. Ever since Julie was a little girl, when she got scared, she would put her hand underneath her bed, and her dog would lick her hand to comfort her. Well, now Julie was 14, and her parents were going out and were going to be out until late at night. Julie didn't want to stay home alone, but her parents told her she was old enough to stay home alone and that she would be fine. Julie's parents left at 8 p.m. After an hour and a half of watching TV, Julie went to bed. She was kind of scared, sleeping with no one home, when she heard a whimpering sound, almost like a puppy whining. She put her hand under her bed, and her hand got licked. She tried to fall asleep again. Then she heard the whining again, the whimpering sound. So once again she put her hand under her bed, and her hand was licked. At some point during the night, Julie heard a loud braying, crying sound. She startled in her bed, and she was afraid to get up. She put her hand underneath the bed, and it was not licked. As she called out for her dog, she heard nothing. She bravely, eventually, got up and started to look for her dog while calling his name. As she made her way into the bathroom, Julie flipped on the light. She looked at the mirror. Written in blood on the mirror was this: "Sometimes maniacs lick hands too." Drive of Danger. It was a late night, rainy and very dark. A young woman was driving home alone from her work after a long, tiring day. Her two-seater pickup truck had been driving unsteadily through the rain for the last half an hour, and she still had another half an hour to go before she got home. As she made to a turn at the fork in the road, she happened to glance down and notice her fuel gauge. Oh no, she thought. The needle was hovering right above the empty mark. Sighing, she continued on the left fork to the gas station that was not that far ahead. The station was almost empty, only with one other car being filled up, an old red Nissan. The woman waved a weary hello to the driver, and he waved back with equal tiredness. Apparently she wasn't the only one driving a long way home late tonight. After her bill had been paid and her car was burping with satisfaction at its full tank of gas, the woman climbed back in the passenger seat. She started the engine and closed the window, which she had left open to grab her wallet, driving on into the pounding rain. As she pulled out of the gas station, she noticed the driver of the red Nissan leaping into his car and speeding off behind her. How odd, she thought. Maybe he got an urgent phone call. But the Nissan didn't pass her when it came up behind her. The man drove at the same pace as her, revving his engine loudly. What's going on here? The woman wondered nervously. As she put her blinker on to turn at the right fork again, the Nissan driver suddenly turned his brights on, blinding her as she tried to look in the rearview mirror. What in the hell? She gasped aloud, pressing down hard on the gas and speeding ahead. The Nissan could keep pace, though, and was soon behind her again. There went the driver again, flashing his brights, once for a few seconds before turning them down again. Maybe he wants me to pull over, the woman thought. Perhaps I have an oil leak or something. But as she turned her wheel to head onto the soft shoulder on the roadside, the man revved his engine powerfully, almost angrily, again, and flashed the Nissan's brights, almost bumping the back of the pickup as he surged forward behind her. He wanted her to keep going. Her heart was racing now. The woman pressed the gas pedal down as hard as she could and watched the shadowed driver in her right side mirror. He would flash his brights every 20 seconds or so, keeping them on for a brief time before turning them off again and revving his engine furiously. On, off, vroom, vroom. The woman's fingers gripped the wheel tighter. What would he do if she tried to get away from him? Would he force her off of the road? On, off, vroom, vroom. Deciding to take the chance, the woman turned her wheel suddenly and went speeding into a lane on the opposite side of the road, which was southbound instead of northbound. The Nissan driver kept his brights on for a long time as she skidded across the empty northbound and followed her. Oh no, he seemed to be a skilled driver. As she headed back the way she came, the woman swerved, took shortcuts, and doubled back, trying to lose the Nissan. But the Nissan remained steadfastly tailing her, brights flashing blindingly every few moments. On, off. The rain droned down harder against the roof. On, off. The truck's tires squealed as the woman desperately tried to lose the Nissan under an overpass. On, off. The woman's hands pounded hard on the dashboard in the terrible fear and frustration as the tears began to flow from her eyes. On, off. Suddenly, a glowing neon light showed itself just down the road as the woman turned a corner, the gas station. Nearly choking with relief, the woman's pickup whined loudly as she gunned it towards the shelter and safety of the station. Her brakes screeched as she pulled in beside a gas pump, and before the truck had even come to a full stop, she was leaping out of it and sprinting towards the door. She burst in, out of breath and screaming, startling the old woman at the candy counter and the man sleeping in the chair in the corner. She explained almost breathlessly to them and to the police on the phone what had happened. Suddenly, the gas station's door burst open, a man's dark figure coming in out of the storm. Having just finished her story over the phone to the police, the woman screamed, dropping the phone, and fled, taking refuge in a broom closet and locking herself in until the police arrived minutes later. It was only then that she came shaking from the closet and learned the truth. The driver of the red Nissan was not trying to harm her. He was trying to save her. As he had been preparing to pay his gas bill, he had seen a man run out of the bushes behind the gas station and climb into the crawl space behind the seats of the woman's truck, entering through its open window. When the woman had drove away, the Nissan driver had taken off behind her. As he was trying to tell her to pull over, he had seen a dark figure rise up behind the seats, a knife raised in its hand. Knowing that if the woman pulled over, she wouldn't have enough time to escape, the man had done all he could do and flashed his brights, casting a mysterious killer in the light and causing him to duck down. He'd followed the woman desperately, continually flashing his brights, as the man in her back seat continually tried to stab her. After the police heard the man's story, they checked the woman's truck and found, curled up in the back seat, a serial killer that had recently escaped from jail with a knife clutched in his hand. Don't turn on the light. Once there were two girls who shared a college dorm room together. Their names were Megan and Vanita. The girls were out partying one night. Megan noticed that she forgot her purse and went back quickly to the dorm. Without turning on the lights, she walked in and grabbed the purse. Then she returned to the party. Later on in the night, Vanita got tired. She tried to find Megan at the party and tried to call her phone, but she was unsuccessful. She left without letting Megan know that she was going to go home and go to sleep. Megan continued to party on all night long, dancing, drinking, and hanging out with her friends. She was unaware that Vanita had even left the party. The next morning she awoke. She wondered, oh, I haven't talked to Vanita. I wonder if she met up with some guy or something like that. On her walk back to the dorm, she noticed there was a lot of police cars outside. She walked up to an officer and she said, "Officer, what's the problem?" "I'm sorry, young lady. There's been a murder inside the dorm." Oh my gosh, this is my dorm. Please let me in. Please let me see." "I'm sorry, young lady. I can't do that. I can't let you in." After pleading and pleading with the officer, making up excuses on why she needed to go inside, the officer finally was worn down and grew tired of talking to her. He let her pass. As Megan ran upstairs to her room, she walked in and noticed that it was overflowing with officers. She looked at the bed, and she saw her roommate there, almost fully covered in a plain white sheet. She looked at the mirror right above her roommate's head, and she saw written in big red letters, "Aren't you glad you didn't turn on the light?" Ghost on the track. The number 12B train was on its usual journey from Royston to Moncton, taking workers to and from the coking factory. That day was supposed to be wet and gloomy, and a mist is said to have swept in from the east that cold autumn night. The moon was full, looking over Royston that night, but still, wives and children waited patiently for the men to return home safely. The train hurried along that night, leaving behind the company of the factory, and entered the bleak and lonely night. The train was nearing the tunnel that night, but the driver saw an old man crossing the tracks, so he ordered the train to halt. It was too late. The old man was hit, and the driver wondered where the man's body was, until the old man appeared before him and stated these words, "Sleep safely this night, as it will be your last." Everyone who was on that train died mysteriously that night, and the tracks were closed, but now the superstition is past, and the tracks will open again. The Girl at the Underpass. Not long ago, but before interstate highways ran around towns and cities, a young man left Greensboro late one night to drive to his old home in Lexington. At that time, just east of Jamestown, the old road dipped through the tunnel under the train tracks. The young man knew the road well, but it was a thick, foggy night in early summer, and he drove cautiously, especially when he neared the Jamestown underpass. Many wrecks had taken place at that spot. He slowed down on the curve leading to the tunnel and was halfway through it when his eyes almost popped out of his head. Standing on the roadside, just beyond the underpass, was an indistinct white figure with arms raised in a gesture of distress. The young man quickly slammed on his brakes and came to a stop beside the figure. It was a girl, young, beautiful, resplendent, in a long white evening dress. Her troubled eyes were glaring straight toward him. Obviously she was in need. He jumped from the car and ran around to where she stood motionless. "Can I help you?" he said. "Yes." Her voice was low, strange. "I want to go home. I live in High Point." He opened the door and she got in. As they drove off, he said, "I'm glad I came by. I didn't expect to find anyone like you on the road so late at night." "I was at a dance," she spoke in a monotone. My date and I had a quarrel. It was very bad. It made him drop me off back there. He tried to continue the conversation, but she would say nothing more until they were into High Point. Turn at the next left, she said. I live 3 doors on the right. He parked before a darkened house, got out of the car, and went around to open the door for her. When he reached the door, there was no one there. He looked in the back seat. No one there. He thought she might have rushed up the sidewalk and out of sight. Confused by all this and undecided about what to do next, he thought it was only reasonable to find out if she had entered the house. He went up the steps and knocked on the door. No one came. He knocked louder, yet again. There was no sound anywhere. After a third knock, through the side panes a dim light appeared from the pitch-black hallway. Finally, the door was opened by a white-haired woman in a nightrobe. Hello, miss. I just brought a girl to this house, he explained, but now I can't find her. Have you seen her? I picked her up out on the highway. Where? I picked her up at the Jamestown underpass. She told me she'd been to a dance and was on her way home. Oh, yes, I know, said the woman, wearily. That was my daughter. She was killed in a wreck at the tunnel 5 years ago tonight, and every year since, on this very night, she signals a young man like you to pick her up. She's still trying to get home. The young man turned away from the doorway, speechless. The dim light in the house went out. He drove on to Lexington, but never has he forgotten, nor will he ever forget, the beautiful hitchhiker and how she vanished into the night. La Mala Hora. My friend Isabella called me one evening before dinner. She was sobbing as she told me that her and her husband Enrique were getting divorced. He had moved out of the house earlier that day, and Isabella was distraught. I called my husband, who was on a business trip in Chicago, and he agreed that I should go stay with Isabella for a few days to help her during her difficult time. I packed a small suitcase and I got right into the car. It was late, and it would take me at least 4 hours to drive from my home in Santa Fe. Isabella was expecting me to arrive around midnight. As I traveled down the dark, wet highway, I kept feeling chills, as if someone or something were watching me. I kept looking in the rearview mirror and glancing into the back seat. No one was there. Don't be ridiculous, I told myself, wishing fervently that I was home in my bed instead of driving on a dark, rainy highway. There was almost no traffic, and I heartily wished I would soon reach Santa Fe. I turned off the highway just before I reached the city and started down the side roads that led to Isabella's home. As I approached a small crossroads, I saw a woman step into the street directly in front of my car. I shrieked in fright and slammed on my brakes, praying that I would miss her. The car shuddered to a halt, and I looked frantically around for the woman. Then I saw her, right beside my window, looking in at me. She had the face of a demon, twisted eyes, glowing red, and short, pointed teeth. I screamed as she leapt at my window, her clawed hand striking the glass. I put my foot down on the accelerator and the car leapt forward. For a few terrible moments, she ran alongside the car, keeping up easily and striking at me again and again. Then she fell behind, and in the rearview mirror I saw her growing taller and taller until she was as large as a tree. Red lights rolled around her like a mist, and she pointed after me, her mouth moving, though I could not make out any words. I immediately jerked my attention back to the road, afraid what might happen to me if my car ran off the street. I made it to Isabella's house in record time and flung myself out of the car, pounding on her door frantically and looking behind me to see if the demon-faced woman had followed me. Isabella came running to the door and let me in. "Shut the door! Shut it!" I cried frantically, brushing past her into the safety of the house. "Jane, what's wrong?" she asked, slamming the door shut. She grabbed my hand and led me into the living room. I sank onto the couch and started sobbing in fear and reaction. After several minutes, I managed to gasp out my story. Isabella gasped and said, "Are you sure you were at the crossroads when you saw her?" I nodded, puzzled by her question. "It must have been La Mahora," Isabella said, wringing her hands. "The bad hour?" I asked. "This is bad, Jane. Very, very bad," Isabella cried. La Mahora only appears at the crossroads when someone is going to die. Ordinarily, I would have laughed at such superstition, but the appearance of the demon woman had shaken me. Isabella got me a cup of hot cocoa, brought my luggage in from the car, and sent me to bed. She was so concerned for me that she didn't once mention the divorce or Enrique. I felt much better the next morning, but I could not shake the feeling of dread that grew within me all day. Neither of us mentioned La Mahora, but we were both thinking of her when I told Isabella that I wanted to go home. Isabella insisted on accompanying me. I flatly refused to drive after dark. I was afraid I would see the demon woman again when I passed the crossroads. When I left the next morning, and we hadn't been home more than 20 minutes when a police car pulled into my driveway, I knew at once what it meant, and so did Isabella. The officer spoke very gently to me, but nothing could soften the news. My husband had been mugged on the way back to his hotel after dinner last night. His body had not been found until this morning. He had been shot in the back of the head, and he was killed instantly. Nightmare House. It was a dark and stormy night. Steve had just come in from having tied down anything that could possibly blow away in the wind outside. Cold was seeping into his bones. He decided to go sit by the fireplace to warm up. He closed the door to the large living room of the large house he had just purchased. His wife and daughter were back at the old home, gathering up some of the last items to be moved out to their new home. Steve decided to stay the night by himself to get a feel for the house. The house was probably too large for such a small family, but Steve couldn't pass up the goodbye and got on it. An old antique home, incredibly large in a quiet, secluded area, for such a small price. Steve still couldn't believe how lucky he was. The television was one of the items his wife was bringing the next day, so he decided to read a book to pass the time. He sipped at his hot coffee while being warmed by the crackling fireplace. Steve couldn't help but to look forward to many more nights like this, all snug in front of the grand fireplace on the cold winter nights that would eventually come. He had just started to get into his book when he heard a tapping sound from the upper floor. Steve brushed it off quickly. Old houses like this always made sounds like that in the movies, even though I'm sure it's had enough time to settle. He had to chuckle over his corny joke. He went back to his book, but the sound started up again. It seemed to be moving across the room upstairs. Perhaps it's mice, thought Steve. I should really look into that tomorrow morning. The wife is not going to be pleased to find mice in their new home. Tomorrow, though. No use chasing mice in the dark. Then Steve heard what sounded like a door opening upstairs. The big room was starting to feel a little bit less cozy. He tried to pass it off as his imagination running wild and tried to immerse himself in the book. It really did him no good, because this time the sounds didn't go away. The tapping and footsteps started to sound like they were coming down the stairs that led to the living room's door. Thump, thump, thump. Louder and louder as they went down. Steve had put the book down now and was staring at the door with great intensity. What if it's a robber, he thought, or worse. No, he mustn't let his imagination go wild. He stared at the great door, and he heard the footsteps keep thumping, finally coming off the stairs and towards the door. Thump, thump, thump. He stared at the door, his fear increasing. Thump, thump, thump. The fireplace suddenly went out. The door handle started to turn. Steve was too frightened to get up to stop it, stuck in his place by fear. Slowly, the door creaked open until it was finally completely open to Steve. A great blinding light filled the room from the door. A blood-curdling scream arose from Steve. The next morning, Linda pulled into the driveway in her truck. She was sure she finally had gotten every last thing and was ready to move into the new home. Her daughter bounced out of the car and ran towards the house. Linda thought, not for the first time, that the house was much too big for the three of them, but Steve was too much in love with it for her to change his mind. Steve, she had told him not to spend the night in the house alone, but he had insisted. She smiled to herself. The big goof was probably going to tell their daughter all kinds of ghost stories he had made up last night, and she'll end up trying to soothe her to bed tonight. Her daughter bounded into the house. She followed closely behind. She called for Steve. No answer. Probably still asleep in that huge living room, where he can't hear us through that large door. He loved that room most about this house. She told her daughter to check the living room for her father. Her daughter went off to do that. Linda started unpacking some of the food they had brought in the kitchen when she heard a scream from her daughter. She ran to the living room to see what was the matter. She looked in and screamed herself. Steve was sitting in his chair, book on the floor. His hair had turned stark white. His clothes were ripped, and it looked like he had tried to claw his eyes out with all the claw marks on his face. He was dead, with a look of stark terror etched forever on his face. Linda retched, vomited, and began to cry. What could have possibly done this to her husband? What? Then, through her sobs, and her daughter's screaming, she thought that she could hear a thumping sound upstairs. Not in my neighborhood. When I was 18, I started babysitting my aunt's youngest 3 kids. I always got a very uneasy feeling when I went into her house. The only reason I agreed to stay in the house was because I was just out of high school and I needed the money. You need to know that her house is a bi-level. When entering her house, you have to go either upstairs to the right or downstairs to the left. Almost right away, weird things started to happen. At first, it was small things like thumping on the walls, things going missing, and so on. But then things started to get more and more scary. One morning, I was in the kitchen fixing their breakfast while the 3 kids, ages 5 to 9, were in the living room watching TV. From where I was standing, I could see all 3 of them sitting on the couch. The middle girl got up to go to the bathroom. Halfway down the hall, she turned around and ran back to me and started crying. When I asked what was wrong, she said she saw a man walk from her room to her brother's room. My first thought was, oh God, someone's in the house. I made the 3 kids go outside while I grabbed a ball bat and searched both rooms. No one was there. I asked her to tell me what he looked like. She described in detail the clothes he was wearing. I have to tell you, she's not the kind of kid that makes things up. And just by seeing how scared she was, I knew she was telling the truth. There's so many things that happened that it would take me forever to describe all of them to you. Several weeks later, all 4 of us were eating breakfast in the living room when we heard someone. It sounded like a girl or a young boy. We heard someone say, "Help," and then the sound of someone falling down the stairs. Now, while everything that happened upstairs was scary, none of it felt like it would be harmful. I cannot say the same thing about the downstairs. I would not even let the kids go down there by themselves. I called that area the center point of evil. One day in the spring, we had a horrible thunderstorm. The schools had let the kids out early because of the weather. Around 4 o'clock, a tornado watch was issued. As much as I hated the downstairs, we all went down there for our safety. All 4 of us were huddled in a pile in the far corner of the room. From where we were, we could see down the small hallway into the laundry room. All of a sudden, a black figure in the form of a person started to come out of the laundry room, paused, and then started moving down the hallway. I did the only thing I could think of, and I asked my great-grandfather for help. He's always the spirit I turn to for strength. I said, "Grandpa, I'm so scared." As soon as I said this, the thing disappeared. I have no idea if this was by a coincidence or if my grandpa truly had something to do with it. Shortly after this happened, I quit that job. I couldn't take it anymore. My aunt still lives in the house, and I refuse to go farther than her front yard. On Washington Rock. The dream was so vivid, she didn't realize at first that it was a dream. The party was crowded, the guests cheerful, and the food was delicious. Then a rumor began to circulate among the guests. The devil was coming to the party. The devil was on the way. She didn't pay much attention at first, until a hush came over the crowd. Turning to see what it was, she saw a tall, handsome blonde man standing at the doorway, greeting the hostess. Around her, the murmurs began. It was the devil. He'd come. She watched out the corner of her eye as the devil made the rounds of the room. He looked so ordinary, it was hard to believe that this was actually the devil. He then came to her group. As soon as he joined them, she knew the rumor was true. This was not someone to be trifled with. Frightened, she grabbed for a Bible that the hostess had left lying on a nearby end table and threw it at the devil. For a moment, their eyes locked. The devil's eyes were full of ferocious anger, terrible evil, and malevolent malice directed right at her. She thought she would be dead. It was then that she woke. She lay there trembling in her bed with the light on until dawn arrived. The next morning was the end of her term. Her parents and younger sister helped her clear out her dorm room and pack the car. It was dusk before they settled into their seats for the 2-hour drive home. They talked excitedly as they drove towards their home in New Jersey, interrupting each other often, contradicting themselves and laughing. It was good to be together again. They were 15 minutes from home when they left the highway. Her father turned on the Washington Rock Road that led up the mountain, through the sea bend around the Washington Rock State Park, and then down the other side of the mountain. As they drove up the steep hill, a noisy motorcycle tailgated them, trying to pass, even though the road was windy and narrow. Finally, the hill grew so steep that the driver was forced to slow down, and eventually, they pulled away from him entirely. The car reached the top of the hill and started around the long sea curve that took them through the end of the park. The park was dark and still. The whole family automatically looked to their right, out over the gorgeous view of New York City skylines. They all saw the small park cart, sitting next to the road just inside the park boundary. It was parked directly underneath the only street light where you couldn't fail to see it, and inside the vehicle, she started trembling fiercely. Inside the vehicle was a tall, handsome, blond man with eyes full of ferocious anger, terrible evil, and malevolent malice. It was the man from her dream. The man everyone said was the devil. The tension in the car was palpable. She had mentioned her dream to no one, but her parents and her sister all felt the evil pulsing from the still figure in the cart. No one spoke as they drove past the man. Suddenly, the engine gave a strange cough. Her father gunned the motor, once, twice, in a silent, desperate battle to keep moving. She gripped her hands together, praying silently as she stared at the figure opposite of their car. The engine caught again, and her father pressed down hard on the accelerator. Then they were past the man and roaring away from the park and towards the downward slope of the mountain. She was sweating profusely, unable to stop shaking. She looked back out the window at the man in the park and saw the motorcycle come roaring at last to the top of the hill. It drove halfway around the sea bend, and as it drew opposite the figure in the cart, she heard the engine of the motorcycle cough, and then stall. And then the park was out of view, and they were riding silently towards home, not daring to speak until they were safely indoors. She often wonders what happened to the man on the motorcycle that night. Did he meet the devil? Screams in the dark. She was my best friend, but I try never to think about her. It hurts too much. It's only on certain nights, and when I'm all alone in my room, that I actually remember. It was last year when my best friend asked me to stay at her house overnight. She lived in a big gloomy house set way back in the woods far from the road. She didn't want to be alone there at night. Her parents had gone out that evening and wouldn't be back until the next afternoon. My friend said we could have a really good time without her parents around. So, after a little bit of convincing, I decided to stay the night. We watched TV and ate popcorn in the living room until late at night. All of a sudden, the power went out. We were in total darkness, and we both got a little bit scared. We hadn't noticed it before, but now the downstairs seemed far too big and almost sinister looking. We could only find one single candle in which to light our way to bed. We could only find a singular candle in which to light our way to her bedroom. We started to go upstairs, and then all of a sudden, we both started running up the steps, as if something was coming up from behind us. After we closed the door, we laughed at ourselves a little bit. After all of that, neither of us were extremely dismayed, especially for my friend, who was much more adventuresome. We laid there and chatted for a little while underneath the feeble light of the candle. Suddenly, we heard a sound from somewhere below. It sounded like somebody sharpening a knife against stone. Very, very faint, but audible. Then we heard another sound. It sounded like someone was moving around the house. We both stopped talking and stared at each other, beginning to feel really scared inside. For a while, there was just silence in the room. I was extremely frightened, but my friend started to laugh. She said that she'd heard sounds like that in her house before. She said it was probably just the shutters or something. That made me feel a lot better, and we started to talk again. And then we heard the sound again. The sound made my head hurt, as if somebody's fingernails were scratching on a chalkboard. But this sound was much worse. It shrieked up from the dark and lonely rooms below us. My friend got a horrible look in her eyes, as though something horrible had come into her head. My friend said that she was going down to investigate. I tried to persuade her, but before I could catch her, she took the candle and departed out of the room, slamming the door shut. Ignoring my pleas not to go downstairs, she left me alone in absolute darkness. I heard her footsteps as she ran down the first flight upstairs, and then I heard her stop. I sat there in the dark, sick with fright. After a while, I called out my friend's name, but my voice was greeted with only cold silence. I didn't want to stay there in the dark room alone, but even more than that, I didn't want to go out into that other, more forbidding darkness. I heard it again, that disgusting sound. Then I heard my friend's footsteps, moving down the next and final flight of stairs. She went more slowly, as if she really didn't want to go down there. I heard her reach the bottom of the stairs. I waited in the room, wondering what my friend was doing. I told myself that she must be all right. You see, the noise had stopped right after I heard her reach the bottom of the stairs. It didn't come at all after that anymore. My friend probably had just fixed the shutter, or whatever was making that horrible screeching noise. She liked to play around. She probably knew what the noise was the entire time. She just acted strangely to scare me. Maybe she was sitting on the steps now, just laughing at me. I thought about going downstairs myself, but a feeling of fear swept over me. It held me back like a hand against my throat. I decided I would wait where I was for my friend to return. I'd wait here until their parents returned if that's what it took. Nothing could make me leave my secure darkness for that darker unknown outside of the room. Time passed as I fearfully waited my friend's return. My ears strained for any sound and my nerves tingled at imagined shadows. After a long silence, I heard the sound of a footstep coming up the stairs. Then another. A slow, shuffling noise on the bottom step. Was it my friend? It had to be. Yet the footsteps seemed too heavy and too deliberate. My heart began to pound, and for that moment I lost control of my mind. It flew to the most horrible corners of my imagination, and I shivered with terror. I decided if it was my friend, I would get her back for playing this awful trick on me. And if it wasn't, well, there was nothing I could do. The shuffling footsteps had reached the second flight of stairs. I cowered back towards the backboard of the bed in terror. I felt the skin crawl on the back of my neck as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs and moved slowly down the hall towards the room I was in. They came along the hall and turned into the room. My eyes forced wide awake from the panic state of shock and horror as the door creaked slightly as it swung open. I stared at the dark figure looming in the doorway. I called out to my friend, but there was no answer as the steps came out across the bedroom. I laughed anxiously and begged for my friend not to play jokes on me, but only silence answered as the footsteps paused right beside the bed. I reached out my hand and felt a wave of relief as it touched the soft edge of my friend's dressing gown. I was so happy. I no longer wanted to scare my friend back. I lifted my hand up and around the nightgown collar to touch my friend's face, but instead I felt something cold and wet. As my fingers moved up, There was nothing. Only the bloody stump of where my friend's head had been. When the girl's parents arrived back home, their eyes were seared by a dreadful sight. On the stairs there was a trail of blood. There were bloody footprints leading upwards. As they made it to their daughter's bedroom, they saw her corpse on the ground, its head severed from the trunk. On the bed, her friend sat, her lips mumbling the torched fantasies of a maniac. In time, the police officials pieced together the story from her ravings. She remained completely mad. The deed was eventually contributed to a homicidal lunatic who had just escaped from the nearby sanatorium. Bloody Mary. Once upon a time, there was a woman called Mary Worth. Everyone insisted she was a witch, and no one dared go anywhere near her house. One day, all the girls in the neighborhood went missing one by one. No one knew where they went. The bravest of the townspeople went to old Mary's home. Strangely, Mary looked younger and more up to date than before. Seeing that they had no proof of anything, they left. Then one night, an old woman tried to stop her daughter from going outside. The daughter kept walking, and no matter what, she could not stop the little girl. It was almost as if she was in a trance. Eventually, after following the girl, standing in her path, trying to physically stop her, the woman discovered that she was walking to Mary's home. She stood outside as the girl let herself in, trying desperately to get her to stop. While still standing outside, she watched in horror as Mary swooped in and killed her daughter, began to drink her blood to make herself young again. The woman screamed in terror, ran back home, and roused her husband, screaming to her husband, "It's Mary! It's Mary! Mary killed our daughter! Mary killed our daughter! Come quick!" Without any hesitation and without any disbelief, her husband jumped up, ran to the barn, grabbed his pitchfork, and began running to Mary's house. Along the way, he shouted and roused as many townsfolk as he could. By the time he arrived at Mary's house, he had quite a group of people with him. They began screaming, beating on the door, trying to get Mary to come outside. After a while of trying to get Mary to come outside, the townsfolk began to get angrier and angrier. Soon, Mary appeared at the window, looking rejuvenated and younger than ever. As she stood there and laughed at the townsfolk, they got an idea. They decided they were going to try to burn her out. They started a small fire that soon rose to a giant blaze. Very shortly after that, Mary's house was engulfed in flames. She stood at the window, smiling and laughing. Mary never came out of the house. She was burned to death in that fire. Even as she was on fire, Mary was overcome with vanity. Before she succumbed, she uttered a curse, that whoever says her name 3 times in the mirror at the minute of midnight will get the same treatment that she did on that very night and live on as another Bloody Mary forever. Do not say Bloody Mary's name 3 times in the mirror at the minute of midnight. Something black and cold. It started with little things, strange incidents that were sometimes inconvenient, sometimes almost amusing. But then the heavy trouble began, and the terror. In the early 1970s, 2 sisters, Lois Dean and Deantha Summer, moved their families into 2 old houses in the middle of Rawlins, Wyoming, a small city in the Rocky Mountains. Lois and her husband and their 6 children moved into the big house. Diantha and her 2 sons took the carriage house right behind the main house. Very soon after that, strange things began to happen in the big house. Lights kept turning on and off. At first the adults thought it was just the kids playing around, but they soon found that the lights seemed to be going on and off by themselves, even when no one else was around. Thinking that it must be an electrical problem, Lois and her husband had the house rewired, but it kept happening. When the children were playing games, they would leave the room for a minute and then come back to find game pieces missing. An older daughter found the colors in their makeup kits often smeared together. At first she thought the younger children were doing it, so she banished them from her room, but it kept happening even after she padlocked the door. The family dog wagged its tail as though at an invisible guest, and his eyes followed something across the room, often. Sometimes in the big house, the bathroom cabinet would be found completely empty. Toothbrushes, combs, and medicines would be all gone, to be found later in odd places. Again, Lois thought it was the children, but it even happened when they were all at school and she was alone in the house. Then things began to get really rough. A boyfriend of one of the girls was playfully climbing through a window. Something unseen picked him up and threw him inside against the wall. That was the end of that boyfriend. He never came back for another visit. Not long afterward, one of the younger boys said he had seen something in the garage. Mike, Diantha's 14-year-old, decided to take a look. He started out the back door of the big house and he suddenly felt two hands grab him and throw him through the air, back into the kitchen, into the refrigerator. He had red marks on his chest, as if something had scratched him when grabbing him. Lois was infuriated. She began yelling, "I don't care who you are. I'm not putting up with you coming into my house and hurting my kids." She was so angry that she was momentarily unafraid. She dashed out into the garage. There she saw a black shape. "It was big and billowy," she says, "and it was dressed like a woman in something black and long." It came towards her smoothly, as though it were on wheels. Something black and cold started coming out of it, like ribbons, she recalls. It started wrapping me in those strands. I could feel their coldness. I couldn't even move. Then she felt her sister, who saw the shape too, grab her from behind and jerk her away from the thing and back into the big house. The two sisters sat up all night, praying as hard as they could. The prayers may have had a good effect, for they never saw the thing again. They took to calling that incident the main event. Afterward, they felt the atmosphere to be a little less oppressive. However, everyone still had a sense that the place was not quite right, and before long, both families moved out. In talking to the neighbors, only one event in the past seemed to hold a clue. Back in the early 1900s, a graveyard on the property was dug up and moved to another location. Rumor has it that 2 bodies were left behind. Are these the 2 different restless spirits? We may never know. The birth of the Jersey Devil. A storm was raging that night in 1735 when Mother Leeds was brought into bed in childbirth. The room was full of womenfolk gathered to help her, more out of curiosity than of goodwill. They had all heard the rumors that Mother Leeds was involved in witchcraft and had sworn she would give birth to a devil. Tension mounted when at last the baby arrived. It was a relief, and, to some, a little bit of a disappointment, when the baby was born completely normal. But a few moments later, before their terrified eyes, the child began to change. The room erupted with screams as the child grew at an enormous rate, becoming taller than a man and changing into a beast which resembled a dragon, with a head like a horse, a snake-like body, and bat's wings. As soon as it was full grown, the monster began beating all the women, including its mother, with its thick forked tail. With a harsh cry, it flew through the chimney and vanished into the storm. The monster of Leeds, or the Jersey Devil, as he was later called, still haunts the pines of New Jersey, wreaking havoc upon farmers' crops and livestock, poisoning pools and creeks, and appearing on the Jersey shore just before a shipwreck. The Black Ribbon. Long ago, a young man met and fell in love with a beautiful young woman. She was always dressed exquisitely, and she always wore a silk black ribbon around her neck. Soon the man and the woman were married and moved into a little cottage by the sea. They started out very happily, but just a short time later, the young man became more and more curious as to why his wife wore a silk black ribbon around her neck all of the time. One day, he decided to ask her. The only answer that he received was that he would be very sorry if she took it off, so she would never, ever take it off. The young man wasn't happy with his wife's answer. He didn't feel like he actually got an answer. He felt like it was a riddle or something like that. More and more time passed, and eventually, all the young man could think about was that silk black ribbon. One day, out of sheer curiosity, he awoke before his wife. He went into her sewing box and got a pair of her scissors. He snuck over to the side of the bed, and he cut off that silk black ribbon that was around her neck. Instantly, his wife woke up screaming. As she startled, her head became unattached from her torso, fell off, and rolled onto the floor. As she looked up at her husband, her severed head screamed, "I told you that you would be sorry."